Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. 40 years on, the Islamic Republic of Iran is both an ideological power wishing to export its fundamental theology and a realistic nation-state aware of power politics. The two streams are reflected in the struggle apparently involving major figures in the regime following the latest flare-up with the United States. To discuss Iran's ideological aspirations and hurdles, we're joined here in the studio by Dr. Menahem Merhavy, who is a research fellow at the Truman Institute at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Meir Javedanfar, who is an Iran lecturer at IDC Herzliya.
Thank you.
Welcome. Mr. Oren, please elaborate on this topic and give us a better understanding also with regard to the current events that are taking place.
Most modern nation states shy away from an official ideology, and even if they do have one or a preferred religion, such as Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries, they keep to themselves. They do not aspire to export it to other countries. But Iran, as the successor for the old, the ancient, even Persian Empire, has a revolutionary regime. Not only did it come to power in a revolution in 1979, but its declared aim is to export this revolution to other countries, as well as to establish the dominance of Iran as a country in the Middle East and perhaps beyond. And as we see in the leadership of Iran right now, as we are in 2020, there are two streams, at least as outside observers see them. There is the ideological conservative one, headed by the Supreme Leader, Ali Khamenei, and supported by the Revolutionary Guards, the main military power safeguarding the regime. And there is the more pragmatic, statesman-like stream, as reflected by President Hassan Rouhani and Foreign Minister Jawad Zarif. And the latest episode, which brought all of this to a head, as has been reported only a few days ago, was Rouhani's threat to resign if the regime goes on with lying about and covering up its responsibility for shooting down the Ukrainian airliners right after the Revolutionary Guards attacked American bases in Iraq and expected a cruise missile response, which made them fire in error at the airliner, which is an understandable accident under battle conditions. And the problem wasn't the shooting down of the airliner itself, unfortunate as it was, but the cover-up. And it's interesting that perhaps for the first time in the annals of this regime, someone as senior as Rouhani, even though he is not the decision maker, was willing to leave his post unless his wish is granted.
Nevertheless, and I'd like to ask you, Dr. Merhavy, when we talk about the position of a president in Iran, he serves at the pleasure of the supreme leader. He's actually an advisor of the supreme leader, and any decision taken by the so-called government of the regime is in correlation with the decision-making of the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei.
Well, you can say this is a situation today, it's true, but historically I think the president was part of a larger system that was elected. So the revolution, in fact, created two systems, really. One is the elected and the other is the non-elected. And the dynamic, especially in the time of since Khamenei became supreme leader, is that the non-elected is way stronger than the elected system. This is actually something that was not necessarily so from the very start, and that's actually one of the things that I think came to light in the late 90s when Khatami was president, and he actually tried to challenge the non-elected system to the point where a group of generals of the IRGC, including the late Salami, sent him a letter that pretty much was a threat, like a gun on the table, saying, if you don't stop that, we'll do what's necessary to save the achievements of the revolution, as they put it. I think in the broader scheme of things, the president is supposed to be way more than an advisor. He is supposed to have power in his hands. He's the one who forms the cabinet. He can also send ministers out of the cabinet if he wishes. So he does have power. However, the dynamic that has been, I think, created in recent years is that the supreme leader is the one who's taking charge of everything that has to do with foreign policy, especially the important decisions about foreign policy, including involvement in other countries in the region and beyond. And that leaves the president with really the domestic arena. And even there, he's very limited because the supreme leader has, his people everywhere in all the different branches of the government. So that leaves the president in a very limited role. And just to add to that, one more thing, the fact is that Rouhani, unlike his, I think, some hopes and some wishes that there were abroad, outside of Iran when he was elected, and maybe inside Iran as well, he is much more of a conservative and way more, low-key kind of leader than I would almost even say great figurehead rather than what Khatami was in the late 90s.
And this doesn't go only for him, Mr. Javedanfar. When we're talking about the foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, who initially was thought of as a more pragmatic person, he was very active in different circles within the international community to try and promote Iran as a different character than what the regime is trying to portray, has at some point declared his resignation several months back, and then with the backing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, and of course also strong voiced backing by Qasem Soleimani, the assassinated commander of the Quds Force, suddenly he received the backing from the regime, and Hassan Rouhani was also at that point where he refused the resignation, and Zarif was capped as the top diplomat of Iran. From that moment on, it seems like he's taken a turn and has been more a vocal spokesperson for the supreme leader rather than the president himself. To what degree has the two institutions or the two streams that were previously perceived more intertwined today into one direct force that works together, cooperates together, and ultimately adheres to the words spoken by the supreme leader?
To be honest with you, I think his threat to resign did not give him that much more leverage afterwards. But I think it's put him under the tight spot is the assassination of Soleimani, because now anybody who wants to talk to America is seen as somebody who wants to talk is accused of wanting to talk to the murderers of Soleimani. Recently, Zarif said that in an interview with Der Spiegel that we're still willing to talk to the Americans, and now there is under very strong condemnation at home, and there was even demonstrations in front of the Iranian Foreign Ministry. Look, at the end,
he said so, however, if they would alleviate the sanctions and remove all of them, of course, which is
despite
fictitious.
that, we're living in the post-Soleimani era. So he's going to be under look. We have to understand when Ali Larijani, the head of the Majlis, says my job is to put rails behind after the words of the supreme leader, which basically means whatever the supreme leader says, my job is to operationalize them. Javad Zarif he serves the supreme leader more than he serves the people of Iran. It's the same for Rouhani, but he's taking a very tough line against the conservatives now. But at the end of the day, this is a problem in Iran. This has been a problem since Bazargan was Iran's first prime minister. He said that in Iran, being a prime minister, a post which doesn't exist anymore, is like having a knife, but the blade is in somebody else's hand, the supreme leader. This is something, and this is what I think we should keep an eye on, because it's possible that in the first decade of the revolution, because the Prime Minister Mousavi and President Khamenei fought so much, they had a referendum and they got rid of the post of Prime Minister. And now, because in the 30 years of Khamenei, there have been so many presidents who have fallen out with him. Rafsanjani was killed, let's be honest. They found 10 times normal rates of radioactivity on his towel. Mr. Khatami cannot speak. He's not quoted in the press. Mr. Ahmadinejad is only not arrested because it would be embarrassing for the regime. They
Well,
say
he was arrested a few times or detained.
no, not him, not Ahmadinejad.
Ahmadinejad was detained several times. Absolutely.
First that I hear it, but okay. So and it's very possible in the next Supreme Leader will just do away with the whole government thing. It's very possible that this is the situation. So this is the problem. But we have to understand. I actually think Rouhani is a very talented politician. I think he's the most talented politician Islamic Republic of Iran has had. If it was up to him, really had power, Iran would be in a much better place. It would not be nice to Israel, but we would not hear a lot of these things. But at the end of the day, when you have the supreme leader, one point, the Iranian regime is not trying to export the revolution. The Iranian regime is exporting its policies. No country has wanted to have Vilayat Faqih. Iran is the only one. The Iraqis saw it, thanks to Ayatollah Sistani, they don't want to touch it. The Syrians don't want Vilayat Faqih, and maybe Mr. Nasrallah wants Vilayat Faqih, maybe in theory. I don't know if he wants to have somebody. But Iran wants to export its policies in the region and to find common interest. These proxies in Iran, outside of Iran, as much as they serve Iran's interest at times, the model is based on shared interest. Iran is not threatening them to follow its policies.
Mr. Oren?
Look at how systems of government evolved around the world in the 800 years since the Magna Carta, since the absolute rule of the monarch was forced to be shared with others, be they nobles and later parliament. You can see that even though separation of powers is supposed to be the privilege of democracies, in dictatorships too, you have a similar system. And it was like that in Nazi Germany, in the Soviet Union, and now in Iran. You don't call it the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, but you call it the government, the party.
Now, there is an executive, judiciary, and legislative in Iran.
Yes, no, but not the real separation of power.
Oh, sorry, there's no.
The power is shared between the government, the religious guidance, guardians, whatever they call it, and the security and military forces. And these forces themselves are usually divided between various, you can call it National Guard or Revolutionary Guard or Presidential Guard. It was like that in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the Ba'ath Party, and in other places. And the real test comes in a crisis. And right now, Iran is in a crisis, but not yet in the grave point where all of this comes to a head and there is either an explosion or an implosion, and we can see who comes out on top.
Dr. Merhavy, the Ayatollah regime was very smart when it basically took the Iranian economy and intertwined it with its own revolutionary guards to assure that if the Iranian economy fails, only then will the regime fail. And to reach that point, there need to be taken very extensive efforts on the economic front in order to really harm the regime to the point of collapse. To what degree do you think that with all the criticism that we've heard over the course of an extensive period of time with regard to the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against the Ayatollah regime, is it actually taking a toll on the regime's efforts and capacity, as we see really on the ground, actually, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere, the limitations of the RGC, for instance, to export its policy or revolutionary ideology?
Right. So I think the irony is that there's no merging of interests here between what you call the Iranian people represented by the president and the revolutionary guards in the circles closer to the supreme leader. In other words, there's some kind of a state within the state in Iran. And actually, Rouhani speaks about it almost in these very words, and that's his criticism. So the irony, as I call it, is that the sanctions and the pressure on Iran benefits actually a group of people that surround the supreme leader. And it's not just a small circle of people, as it might sound. I'm talking about at least tens of thousands of people that are close to the higher echelons the Revolutionary Guards, and so it's both power in the hands of these people, because again, they're not really with their back to the wall the way it sometimes seems on the Western media. On the other hand, the great weakness it renders them is that they do not feel the pressure. In other words, so you might think of it as a strength, but it's also a weakness, because the popularity or legitimacy, whatever is left of it, of the state, really, of the non-elected systems, I should say, is corroded and is really washed away. So today, in recent years, actually, I can say the Revolutionary Guards have taken off the gloves, and they don't even pretend to be the voice of the people, but rather to really, to rule with a strong hand. And in a way, I think that in the long run, it actually weakens Iran much more than it strengthens it. Even though in the short term, it gives a lot of power to, again, a close, small circle of people.
Mr. Javedanfar, I'd like to ask about the RGC top commander, General Salami, who is orchestrating different operations, both domestic and abroad, quite diligently, I must say, and he's very strategic, if you will. But when we're looking on the domestic thing, and I tend to agree with Dr. Merhavy about the fact that the RGC is not shying away from the fact that they're not necessarily representing the Iranian people anymore on certain fronts, especially when it comes to the protests that were voiced in the street. They treat them as if they're actually anti-Iranian, and they're trying to alienate anyone who is not part of their ideology as a foreign force, if you will. To what degree is that felt on the streets of Iran today? And what do you hear from the streets with regard to the fact that the Iranian regime is not receiving as much vocal support as they used to?
Look, this is something that Mr. Rouhani talks about himself. He said recently that we don't want election because we've just seen the largest number of disqualifications before a Majlis election since, I think, 20 years ago. The sixth Majlis during Khatami, what was that? I think it was 1999, if I'm not mistaken, or 2000. That was the biggest.
Just for the sake of our viewers, the Majlis is the
a parliament.
indeed.
And those people, the incumbent members, we've never seen such a... And the six Majlis people went in the front in the Majlis and they demonstrated, but now they're not doing much. This is something that Rouhani talks about himself. Look, at the end of the day, you have to understand that the regime is under this is an emergency situation. The Iranian regime, look, it's under toughest sanctions ever. Soleimani has just been assassinated. The IRGC says that we are protecting the country in emergency situation, but there is a scenario coming up which could end up hurting the IRGC and could also bring Rouhani to the point of resigning. Mm-hmm. And that's the scenario of in mid-February, Iran has to finally decide whether it's going to join the FATF, the Palermo Convention Against Anti-Money Laundering, or not. If Iran doesn't if Khamenei, this is Khamenei's decision ultimately, he tries to delegate it, but we know at the end of the day, this is something nobody wants to touch. If Khamenei does not allow Iran to join the FATF, even Chinese banks, Russian banks will not be willing to do business with Iran, never mind European banks. And I think basically Rouhani will have no economy to manage. And that is why I think there's a 50% chance that if FATF is not approved by the Iranians, Rouhani could resign. And if it is approved, then Rouhani is going to be under unprecedented pressure. Why? Because in Iran, there are something like 45 to 50 million fake bank accounts. Just think about it, a population of 80 million, 40 to 45 million, some say 50 million fake bank accounts. Money laundering is a huge industry. Who earns from it? IRGC. If IRGC lose out, who are they going to go after? They're going to go after Ayatollah Khamenei, not Netanyahu. They're going to go after Rouhani. So I think in Iran, the situation is about to become much worse, and Rouhani knows it. But in terms of legitimacy, look, the plane was shut down. It was an accident. But what wasn't an accident is that the operator tried to contact his commander. Where the hell was his commander? Commander didn't answer. Is the commander going to be made to answer? The other question, why weren't the skies of Iran, the skies of Imam Khomeini airport not shut down during that time? Because they wanted to use it as kind of a human shield so that the Americans say, oh, there are planes flying. These are unforgivable. Not just the issue of Many of us have had friends who fly in and out of that airport. It could be any of our families. And now they're hounding the families. So, this is the regime is doing the job of everybody else to delegitimize it. But what does it mean it's going to go away soon? Not as long as they have weapons.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to focus on another hurdle that Iran is facing. Of course, we'll have to zoom out a little bit from Iran and notice to the increase of cooperation between France, the United States, and Israel on the Eastern Mediterranean front with regard to the offshore gas reservoirs that the French now want to also participate in and provide the backing. And one of the points that I've been hearing more and more is that France has been also giving more and more guarantees that it will take a more hardline position vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic. To what degree can we see that form into a united European front against Iran? Also considering the voices that we hear in Great Britain, in Germany, also more and more voices are demanding a shift of policy towards the Ayatollah regime. What is happening there?
The idea sounds promising, but the French being French, one shouldn't put too much of an emphasis on it. France used to follow the franc. Now it's the euro. They sold Iraq their nuclear material and infrastructure for the reactor.
After one was destroyed.
Yes, before and after, and
both were destroyed.
So they will do what their financial interest tells them to. If Israel has more to offer than Iran under certain circumstances, yes. If the winds change, they will change with them.
Also, when we're talking the fact that Saudi Arabia is in the picture, and when it comes to Saudi Arabia, French interests go way beyond the Iranian interests.
That's true, but Saudi Arabia is very weak and vulnerable to Iranian pressure, threats. And we saw that during the summer, after there was no response to the Aramco strike by Iran, the Saudis understood what they had to do, and they started negotiating or opened a channel with the Iranians. But there is another historical irony here, because empires always grow, expand until they are overextended. Now, Iran itself, and then Meir and Menahem know it much better than I do. Iran itself is no longer majority Persian. It has approximately 1/2 of Persian extraction, 1/4 Azeri, and then the other quarter also from various
Arab and so on.
Various nationalities, tribes, and what have you. And when they overextend into Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, of course, it's even more of a problem for them. So they are trying to base themselves on Shiite militias from Afghanistan, Pakistan, wherever. But it is going to come back to bite them. This is not the Persia or Iran of old. There could be inner strengths which will make the regime implode.
Just to point, and this is my perception of the point that you mentioned with regard to Saudi Arabia, a response hasn't happened until it happens. Don't go too quickly about a response not coming. Of course, it's a lot easier to kick someone when he's laying down.
4 months since September.
4 months is short, but also very long. Dr. Merhavy, we're running out of time for today's program. How do you perceive the global hurdle that Iran is currently facing, and to what degree do you think that the Iranians will be able to overcome or reform or even just continue with a certain status quo and hope for the best?
Well, it's hard to say, of course, how Iranians will react. I'll try to say something about that. I think one of the important effects of the recent attack on Soleimani that has not been so noted by many observers is that the U.S. has actually marked its ability to hit targets even if without boots on the ground, and that's a very important lesson for Iran. In other words, if Iran, was musing with the idea that the U.S. wants to back off, to back out of Iraq and other parts of the region, and it will have free field for playground, then I think the U.S. has put it in a very blunt way that no, this is not the case, because even without soldiers on the ground, or very few, relatively speaking, we can still hit some very high-quality targets like Soleimani. So I think that was an important lesson for Iran. The way Iran is dealing with the situation, I think, is kind of a carrot and stick in a way. A carrot in the sense of trying to, yes, to still support some Shiite militias in the region and even outside it, and the stick in the sense of trying to, use those militias to punish its enemies in the region with some success, I would say.
Mr. Javedanfar.
I think if I was Khamenei, I'd worry about how much the Revolutionary Guard hate Rouhani. I think this is something that's something that's going to hamper. It's going to weaken Iran even more, even all these infightings.
And Ismail Jani, to what degree is he able to fill the shoes of
Rouhani, you mean?
Rouhani,
Rouhani. It remains to be seen. Look, this is a
the replacement
issue.
of Qasem Soleimani.
But we have to look further down the geopolitical changes that Lebanon is facing. For example, it will need more than Rouhani's charismatic leadership, if he has one, to overcome Lebanon's economic problems. It will need more than his leadership to overcome the problems in Iraq between the government and Mr. Muqtada al-Sadr, who switched sides. One day joined the Iranians and then switched sides again. The same day, say, okay, but I don't want you to attack Americans. It's and of course there are other issues. In Syria, will the Russians want Iran to stay? Mr. Rouhani could be the most charismatic general in the world, but there are issues that are outside his power, and I think these are issues that need to be addressed as well. But at the end of the day, look, we have 1 year to go before the Iranian elections, one and a half years. The more the regime stops Rouhani, the more it will help anybody in the world who wants to see Iran's economy basically depleted.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today, but I'd like to thank Dr. Merhavy, to thank Mr. Oren and Mr. Javedanfar, and I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.